Hello students, in this video lecture I'm going to talk to you about the layers of the alimentary canal wall and then also walk you through the basics of the rest of the digestive organs. So let's just remember when we're talking about the alimentary canal wall, we're talking about the food tube that all of our food passes through as we are digesting it. And once we get past the throat into the esophagus, the structure of that tube, the way it's constructed, is the same. So that's what we're going to be talking about, and we're going to be filling in this diagram at the bottom, and I'll explain to you what you're looking at. So first, we're going to work our way from the inside where the food is to the outside of this tube. Okay, and this tube has multiple layers, 4 exactly. First of all, we need to know what the opening is called. That is where your food is found. And that hole in the tube and the inside of the tube is known as the lumen. So put as your definition the opening inside the alimentary canal or digestive tube that the food passes through. So technically the lumen is the oral cavity, the space inside the pharynx, the space inside the esophagus, the space inside the stomach, etc. I'm not going to color the lumen. For the actual layers of the tube, I am going to color so you can see how it's layered. The innermost layer, the layer of the tube that's right up against your food, that your food passes through and is in contact with, is called the mucosa. Mucosa. And that word sounds a lot like the word mucus, doesn't it? That's because this layer of the tube produces a lot of mucus, slimy water. In order to help the food move along, we do not want it getting stuck, and to protect the lining of the tube from any harsh chemicals that your digestive system makes. So I'm going to go ahead and color in my mucosa lining, and I'm going to use this light pink color, and you'll notice there's actually multiple layers within the mucosa. So just bear with me. I'm going to color all the way to here. And the picture we're looking at is actually illustrating the small intestine. So it has these really weird finger-like projections, which is not standard for the rest of the tract, but that's what we have. So all of this, and I'm going to draw a simplified version of this off to the side so you get the idea. This kind of picture is pretty fancy. Okay, so I got my mucosa lining here, and I'm going to label it with this label over here, and then also use that same color so it's really easy to tell, the mucosa. Now, I told you I was going to draw a simplified version of this as well, so let me do that over here. I'll make it flat so that it looks really easy, and we'll build on that together. This area here will be the lumen, and I'm going to build the thickness of this tube going outward. So pink is the mucosa lining. Now if we work our way outward, the next layer that we're going to come across is known as the submucosa, which is right underneath the mucosa. So sub meaning under or below. We have lots of blood vessels in this layer. So I'm going to go with something totally unrealistic, just so we can really tell it apart from the mucosa. So my next layer is going to be this section here, and I'm just going to avoid all these glands and lymph nodes that are in here, but this layer of tissue found in the wall of the alimentary canal, albeit esophagus, stomach, small and large intestine, is called the submucosa. It's got lots of blood vessels in it, lots of nerves, and we can see even lymph nodes, glands, all kinds of stuff in the submucosa layer. So it's a pretty busy section. And once again, I'm going to label this and then add a simple layer to my easy version over here. So the submucosa is going to be right on the outside of the mucosa. Remember, L means lumen, that where the food would be located. Okay, so we have 2 layers. Mucosa, which makes lots of mucus that goes onto your food, protects the lining of this tube from any harsh chemicals, and then the submucosa. We're moving our way outward. 3rd out of 4 layers. The next one is called muscularis. And I'm guessing you can see in the word, it's a muscular layer. Generally, there's 2 layers of what's called smooth muscle tissue. The stomach actually has 3. And these are the muscles that will contract to push the food in the right direction in a very coordinated way. So I also wanted to tell you that those contractions that push your food down are known as peristalsis. That is a really important word. Peristalsis keeps our food and our feces moving through the tube so it doesn't get stuck. So muscularis, 2, sometimes 3 layers, and they're drawn differently. So here's the first layer of muscle tissue, and it's actually oriented around the tube in a circular direction. Okay, so think like in a ring around the tube, and that will make the tube's diameter change as it squeezes. And then the second layer is organized long ways on the tube, which is why it's drawn differently. The cells are facing in a different direction. And so this can change the length of the tube. And so using a coordinated muscular contraction pattern, we can push our food along and not let it get stuck. So these are the 2 layers of muscularis responsible for peristalsis, the contractions that push our food down. Now, if you vomit, you have reverse peristalsis, where the muscular layers contract in the wrong direction to get the food out. So there's my muscularis layer, and I'm going to add it to my simple tube. I'm going to do 2 layers. I don't know if it'll end up looking like 2 or not. There's 1. Yeah, I guess you can tell. There's 2 layers of muscularis. And then we're at the outermost layer that would be in contact with the other organs. Notice how thin it is. But that doesn't mean it's not important. I'm going to go with something completely unexpected and color it green. It's on the very surface of the tube. And this is what all the loops and coils of intestine would be in contact with one another. This is the very outside of the esophagus, the very outside of the stomach. And again, I'll add a layer to my simple drawing here, so you get the idea. That green layer is called the serosa layer. And the purpose of that layer, it produces a fluid that allows the different parts of the tube, as they move, right, with muscular contractions, to slip and slide past one another because it's all coiled up in there. And we don't want them sticking to one another. So serosa layer makes a fluid that makes them slippery, so they just slip and slide past one another. So quick review, we have our serosa on the outside, 2 layers of muscularis, then we have the submucosa, then we have the mucosa. So notice our pattern goes like this. And then we have the lumen. Serosa muscularis times 2, or 3 if you're in the stomach, submucosa, mucosa, and then we get to the lumen, which is the space where the food is. So this tubular structure with these layers applies to the esophagus, the stomach, all parts of the small intestine, and all parts of the large intestine. They all have the same basic setup.
The alimentary canal is a single, continuous tube that includes the oral cavity, esophagus, stomach, and intestines. The tissue layers that form the walls of the tube include 2 layers of smooth muscle. The contraction and relaxation of these muscles is called peristalsis. One peristaltic wave can be enough to move a bolus down the esophagus and into the stomach. In the intestines, the waves are smaller and more regular. As one section of the intestine contracts, the section in front relaxes. This occurs in the rhythmic, wave-like patterns that create the peristalsis that propels substances forward.
We're going to run through the rest of the digestive system. We've already learned about the mouth and the pharynx, so let's start out with some review in this area. The space marked A is the oral cavity, and the way that this is organized is there's a little circle next to each letter for you to color. However, I think it's easier if we don't color every structure. So I'm going to leave the oral cavity uncolored. Let's go ahead and fill in letter O, top and bottom. Letter O are the teeth. I'm going to leave those uncolored as well. Inside the oral cavity, we have letter P. Letter P is the tongue, and this always confuses students sometimes because it just doesn't really look like a tongue. So I'm going to grab a light pink color and color that in so it appears a little bit more tongue-like than just this white egg inside the oral cavity. So I've colored the tongue pink, and then I'm just going to mark that I colored it pink over here next to its letter. Okay, let's go ahead and tackle the roof of the mouth, letters X and Z. The more anterior letter X is the hard palate, and the more posterior letter Z is the soft palate. And of course, this area right here, at the very last part of the soft palate, would be where the uvula sits. Let's go ahead and identify the three salivary glands, Q, R, and S. So Q is the sublingual gland, R is the submandibular gland, and S is the parotid gland. And all three of those I'm going to color the same color. So I've chosen yellow for all my salivary glands. I'm also attempting to color the little duct that transports the saliva into the oral cavity. Remember, it helps to chemically digest carbohydrates in the mouth. So adding my color to my letters down here. And we're almost done with this area. Letter B is the next part of the alimentary canal along our journey. And I like this little graphic up to the top. The alimentary canal is like the hole in a donut if the donut was the rest of our body. So food goes in our oral cavity, passes down the pharynx, and then goes through the rest of the alimentary canal, only to exit very differently. So B is the second part of the passageway. B is the pharynx. I'm going to color the pharynx so we can differentiate it from the oral cavity and from the structures that are after that. So remember, the pharynx actually leads all the way up to the nasal cavity. This area at the top would be the nasopharynx. There's a section by the mouth called the oropharynx, and then as it progresses downward becomes the laryngopharynx, because the larynx or voice box would sit here. And then we're going to progress downward into the rest of the food tube. So the food tube that takes us all the way down behind the heart, between the lungs, through the diaphragm, and attaching to the stomach is the esophagus. So I've colored my pharynx the light blue. I'm going to color my esophagus a darker blue, and it's going to extend all the way down to the stomach. And in the esophagus is where the muscular contractions start that help to push the food in the right direction, and those muscular contractions are known as peristalsis. So I've colored my esophagus this darker blue. The next organ that it's getting a little tricky in here because there's a lot of overlap, but the very next organ that we're going to run into is letter D, and I'm giving you the outline here. I think I'm going to go ahead and just leave it at its outline because I think that will be easier to understand. This entire area is the stomach, letter D. The stomach will hold and mix up the food anywhere from 2 to 6 hours before it is released, and there's a doorway called a sphincter on the way out, into letters E, then F, then G. All of that is small intestine, E, F, and G. So what I'm going to do is actually make a little bracket up here. In the key, letters E, F, and G are all small intestine. And there's 3 sections, depending on how close you are to the stomach. The first section is the smallest, and that is known as the duodenum. Spelled exactly like it sounds, duodenum. Sometimes you may hear people pronounce it duodenum. Duodenum. So that's the first about 12 inches of small intestine. Then the second section is known as the jejunum. The jejunum. And the third section that will take us all the way over to the large intestine is called the ileum. Those 3 letters in the sequence, D, J, I. And we want to keep them in that sequence. I'm going to go ahead and color each one of these the same color. And I'm going to choose a color that's light enough where I can still see the letters. So you'll notice I'm starting right off of the stomach, and we have quite a bit of overlap happening here. And then there's this little line right here that shows us where the duodenum ends. But really, it's the same tube. This tube. It's the same tube, and it just transitions right into the next section, which is the jejunum. And then the jejunum turns right into the ileum, which will take us all the way to the large intestine. So twists and turns, loops and coils, and about 10 feet of small intestine in total. Okay, so I've got my small intestine colored, my duodenum, my jejunum, and my ileum. So right now our pathway, and I don't recommend that you add this to your diagram, but obviously I just wanted to give you the idea. You're going to eat the food, chew it up, swallow it, called deglutition, and then after that, muscular contractions push the food down into the stomach. The stomach still has peristalsis happening, and so it will push the food into the small intestine, and it will follow this ridiculous 10-foot long tube like a maze and end up here dumping into the large intestine at this point. So once we get past the deglutition or swallowing part of our alimentary canal, the rest is just muscular contractions that pushes the food along. And it's in the small intestine where all of our digestion is completed and we've absorbed our nutrients. The rest of this tube is actually all large intestine. So I'm going to run a bracket from H all the way to N and identify it as the large intestine. Now, the large intestine is actually about half the length of the small intestine, but it's a larger diameter. So the opening inside the large intestine is larger, and that opening we know already is called the lumen. So let's get started on our labels. The large intestine begins right here at this pouchy section that's called the cecum, and that is letter H, the cecum. So at this point, because we've absorbed all of our nutrients, we're not really talking about food anymore. We're talking about waste, so feces. Off of the cecum is this small worm-like appendage. That is the appendix. So that's going to be H1. And technically, the appendix is not really associated with the system other than the latest theory on its function is that it's a lymphatic organ. But it is hanging off of the cecum. As we move the feces, we're going to contract. The only way out is down here, so we've got to get there. So in order to do that, we're going to run the feces, in this direction. So notice it's moving upward. Now we're going to enter the part of the large intestine that's known as the colon. So letter I, there's many sections of colon. Letter I is part of the colon called the ascending colon. And ascending means to move upward. So this section here, which is letter I, is called the ascending colon. And then the feces is going to actually be pushed around this sharp corner right underneath the liver into the section marked as J. Now you'll notice in your diagram, J is cut, but only so we can see. So we'll stretch all the way over here, pushing the feces across the body from the right side to the left side, over by the spleen. This part that's going across the body is known as the transverse colon, and that is letter J. Transverse means across, so that's an appropriate name for that part of the colon. So we have the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and now look at what direction we have to go. The feces is now going to move downward. So this section here, letter K, is known as the descending colon, because descending means to move downward. Now, it's often really difficult to illustrate this next section of colon in a diagram accurately, but what we're doing is we're taking the feces from this position here by the left hip. We're going towards the center, but we're also going towards the back. So I'm going to kind of accentuate this S curve here because this part of the colon is named for that S curve. It is known as the sigmoid colon, and the Greek letter sigma is an S. So sigmoid colon for letter L. We're still in the large intestine, so we've gone from the cecum to the ascending colon to the transverse colon to the descending colon to the sigmoid colon. And we've already learned about these last two parts of the large intestine. The rectum is M and the anal canal is N. I'm going to go ahead and color all parts of the large intestine the same color. And I'm going to choose a light color so I can continue to see my letters. Keep in mind all the parts that we're talking about today that are part of this food tube are a part of the digestive system called the alimentary canal. So the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the duodenum, jejunum, ileum, and then all the parts of the colon that I just went over. All the way to the anal canal. That's the tube that the food passes through as it is being digested. In just a minute, we will talk about the accessory organs that produce the chemicals we need in order for that digestion to occur. Okay, you'll notice we do have some organs left over, but not that many. This huge organ right here is not part of the alimentary canal, but it is part of the digestive system in that it is an accessory organ. So this gigantic organ here, which is our largest internal organ, is the liver. And the liver produces a substance called bile that helps us to break down fats physically so that we don't have a bunch of fats that are all grouped together in our food. And you may wonder what's going on back here with all this overlap. Well, the liver produces the chemical called bile, but then it is stored in this little pouch, which you can barely see underneath the liver, which is letter U. So actually, I'm going to do something a little different here and make sure that we still know that this is letter U and this is letter T. But that pouch, letter U, is the gallbladder. The gallbladder stores the bile, and then when we need it, it pushes the bile through these tubes into the duodenum. Sometimes people get what's called a gallstone as the bile in the gallbladder gets really hard and concentrated into like a little rock, and it gets stuck in this tube. That can be life-threatening if it's not taken care of. I'm going to go ahead and label letter V as the bile ducts, of which there are many, many. So we're being super general here. The bile ducts. And I colored both the bile ducts and the gallbladder a dark green color. And then we have left this organ behind the stomach, which we really wouldn't get to see much of if this was a real view. And this one I always think looks like a chicken tender. And that one is the pancreas. Pancreas produces most of what we need in terms of digestive enzymes, so it is incredibly important. It's in the digestive system, and it is also in the endocrine system because it produces the hormones that regulate blood sugar. Okay, looks like we missed letter Y way up at the top of the diagram. Letter Y is that little flap of soft cartilage that closes over the airway when we swallow to prevent us from choking. Letter Y is the epiglottis. So food is chewed up in the mouth. That's called mastication. We swallow it. That's called deglutition. And then we use the muscles of the rest of the alimentary canal to push our food down and make sure it's going in the right direction. And those muscular contractions are called peristalsis. So it will move through the esophagus and into the stomach. And the stomach will push it into the three parts of the small intestine: duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, and then on to the large intestine, starting with the cecum, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, and finally, feces exits the anal canal. Our three major accessory organs that help with digestion are the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder.